Hello again. My name's Gabe Zolna. Well, one of my viewers sent me some rather interesting information, and it deals with what's going on now with the South, the Confederate flag, and ultimately, Old Glory. The viewer wrote, "Hi Gabe, I knew some of this from years ago, but not all. I have reason to believe what is stated here is indeed correct. For whatever it is worth, I am sending it along. Phew, so hot where I am you wouldn't believe. I have to go into survival mode when it gets this way. Wish all the good wishes. Son Craig." History books, the media, the school systems, etc. abound in falsehoods and inaccuracies of Confederate and Southern history. This fact sheet will help to clarify and dispel some of these rampant inaccuracies. Myth: the War of 1861-1865 was fought over slavery. Fact: terribly untrue. The North fought the war over money, plain and simple. When the South started secession, Lincoln was asked, "Why not let the South go in peace?" To which he replied, "I can't let them go. Who would pay for the government?" Sensing total financial ruin for the North, Lincoln waged war on the South. The South fought the war to repel Northern aggression and invasion. Myth: only Southerners owned slaves. Fact: entirely untrue. Many Northern civilians owned slaves prior to, during, even after the War of Northern Aggression. Surprisingly to many historian and paired individuals, most Union generals and staff had slaves to serve them. William T. Sherman had many slaves that served him until well after the war was over, and did not free them until late in 1865. U.S. Grant also had several slaves who were only freed after the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. When asked why he didn't free the slaves earlier, Grant stated, quote, "Good help is so hard to come by these days," end of quote. Contrarily, Confederate General Robert E. Lee freed his slaves, which he never purchased. They were inherited in 1862. Lee freed his slaves several years before the war was over, and considerably earlier than his northern counterparts, and during the fierce early days of the war when the South was obliterating the Yankee armies. Lastly, and most importantly, why did northern states outlaw slavery only after the war was over? The so-called Emancipation Proclamation of Lincoln only gave freedom to slaves in the South, not in the North. This Perks Mystify even went so far as to find the state of Delaware rejecting the 13th Amendment in December of 1865 and did not ratify it, the 13th Amendment, to free the slaves, until 1901. Myth: the Confederate battle flag was flown on slave ships. Fact: none of the flags of the Confederacy or Southern nations ever flew over a slave ship, nor did the South own or operate any slave ship. The English, the Dutch, and the Portuguese brought slaves to this country, not the Southern nation. But even more monumental, it is also very important to know and understand that federal Yankee Union ships brought slaves to America. These ships were from the New England states, and their hypocrisy is atrocious. These Federals were one that ended up crying the loudest about slavery, but without their ships, many of the slaves would have never arrived here. They made countless fortunes on the delivery of slaves, as well as the products made from raw materials such as cotton and tobacco in the South. This is the problem with Yankee history, is overwhelmingly portrayed inaccurately by most of the Federal and Yankee books and media. Myth: the Confederate battle flag represented the Southern nation. Fact: not true. While the Southern battle flag was carried into battle, the Southern nation had 3 different national flags during the course of the war. The first national flag was changed due to resemblance to the U.S. flag. The second national flag was subsequently modified due to the similarity to the flag of truce. The third national flag was the adopted flag of the Confederacy. The Confederate battle flag was never a national flag of the Confederacy. It was carried into battle by several armies, such as the Army of the Northern Virginia and the Army of Tennessee. Was also used as a Navy Jack by the Confederate Navy. Myth. The Confederate battle flag is known as the Stars and Bars. Fact. A common misconception. The first national Confederate flag is correctly known as the Stars and Bars. The Confederate battle flag is known as the Southern Cross. Myth. The Confederate battle flag represents racism today. Fact. The Confederate battle flag today finds itself in the center of much controversy and hoopla going on in several states. The cry to take this flag down is unjustified. It is very important to keep in mind that the Confederate battle flag was simply just that, a battle flag. It was never even a national flag, so how could it have flown over a slave nation or represented slavery or racism? The myth is continued by lack of education and ignorance. Those that vilify the Confederate battle flag are very confused about history and have jumped upon a bandwagon with loose wheels. Myth. The United States represents freedom. The United States flag represents freedom. Fact. No chance. The U.S. flag flew over a slave nation for over 85 years. The North tolerated slavery and acknowledged it as a division of labor. The North made a vast fortune on slavery and its commodities. It wasn't until the South decided to leave the Union that the North objected. The North knew it could not survive without Southern money. That is the true definition of hypocrisy. Myth. Abraham Lincoln was the great emancipator. Fact. While Lincoln went down in history as the great emancipator, many would not care to hear his real thoughts on people of color. My dread President Abraham Lincoln was frequently making plans to send all freed slaves to the jungles of Central America once the war was over, knowing the African society would never allow the slaves to return back to Africa. Lincoln also didn't want the slaves in the U.S. He thought the jungles of Central America would be the best solution and conducive to the freed slaves' best interest. The only thing that kept this from happening was his assassination. Myth. The Southern revered slavery. Fact. A very interesting fact on slavery is that at the time of the war of 1861-1865 officially commenced, the Southern states were actually in the process of freeing all slaves in the South. Russia had freed its servants in 1859, and the South took great note of this. Had military intervention not been forced upon the South, a very different America would have been realized then as well as now. Myth. The Confederate Army was comprised of rich slave owners. Fact. Very far from true. The vast majority of soldiers in the Confederate Army were simple men of meager income. Most of them were hard-working farmers and common men, as now very few rich men ever fight a war. Myth. Only the North had men of color in their ranks. Fact. Quite simply a major falsehood of history. Many blacks, both free and their own will, joined the Confederate Army to fight for their beloved Southern home. Additionally, men of other ethnic extractions fought as well. Oriental, Mexican, and Spanish men, as well as Native American Indians, fought with pride for the South. Today, many men of color are members in the heritage group SCV, Sons of Confederate Veterans. These men of color and pride rejoice in their heritage. The continued attacks on the Southern nation, the Confederacy, and the symbols are a terrible outrage to these fine people. These attacks should be denounced with as much fever as those who denounce the South. Myth. The Confederate flags are also authorized upon Iran, KKK, and hate groups. Fact. Quite the contrary. These despicable organizations such as the KKK and Aryans have taken a hollow piece of history and have plagued good Southern folks and the memories of the Confederate soldiers that fought under the flag with their preference agenda. In no way does the Confederate flag represent hate or violence. Heritage groups such as the SCV battle daily the damage done to a proud nation by these hate groups. The SCV denounces all hate groups and pridefully boasts heritage, not hate. Myth: the SCV, Sons of Confederate Veterans, are a racist hate group. Fact: this is a blatant attack on one of the finest heritage groups ever. The SCV, Sons of Confederate Veterans, are a historical, patriotic, and non-political organization comprised of descendants of Confederate soldiers and sailors, dedicated to ensuring that a true history of the 1861-1865 period is preserved and presented to the public. The SCV continues to educate the public on the memory and reputation of the Confederate soldier, as well as the motives for his suffering and sacrifice. The SCV, Sons of Confederate Veterans, are in no way affiliated with, nor does it recognize or condone, the terrible legacy of hate groups such as the KKK. Wow. You know who needs to see this? The governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, needs to see this. And all the local state representatives that are now considering banning the Confederate flag from the grounds of the Capitol. You know who else needs to see this? The leaders of Amazon, the leaders of eBay, the presidents of Wal-Mart, Sears, and any other organization that wants to ban and is banning the Confederate flag and all its memorabilia. Please, this must be sent across the country. I can't thank my viewer enough for taking the time to send me what he did. It's up to you to make sure that people get to read this, get to hear it. I'll attach a copy. You'll have it in written form as well. Totally insane what is being done to this country by this criminal, dysfunctional administration. That's sort of what I think. Listen to what is said in this. Read what is written in this. Pass it along. Our country might depend on people being made aware of what they're not aware of.